Reading 70 from the Psychological Commentaries on the Teachings of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky by Dr. Maurice Nicoll, Volume 1. Birdlet, March 22, 1943. Internal considering and external considering. 5. Some people find it difficult to understand what external considering means, and others to understand what internal considering means. In this work, external considering must be done, and internal considering stopped. To externally consider another person, it is first necessary to put yourself in the other person's position. To do this, you must think of yourself as being this other person, having to do the same things, having the same difficulties, the same handicaps, the same life. Now, if you will begin to think of this preliminary step, you can hardly say that external considering has anything to do with being indifferent. To put yourself in another person's situation calls upon your whole understanding. It requires a directed effort of the mind and feelings, and not merely once, but time and time again. And you will certainly be quite incapable of doing this if you are always preoccupied with your own personal problems and woes, and with the way you are being treated. That is, if you are always taking your life from the standpoint of internal considering. I remember the case of a man who was always internally considering, always suffering, who wrote on his wife's tombstone, "From your heartbroken husband." You see, even then he could only think of himself, of his own suffering. Now, if you begin to externally consider another person over a considerable period, you must again and again put yourself in the other person's place. In this way, you become more conscious. The object of the work is to become more conscious. Self-observation makes you more conscious of yourself. External considering makes you more conscious of others also. Through external considering, things you were not conscious of before are revealed to you. Let us take a simple example of revelations of this kind. You put yourself in another person's position, and after a time you realize that you expect this person to do things you would not think of doing yourself. For example, you expect this person perhaps to put up with conditions that you would not put up with for a moment. Do you see that you have gained in consciousness? Now, if you have a revelation of this kind, it means that you are really beginning to externally consider, to understand what it means to put yourself in another person's position. People who make a great many requirements expect a great deal from others, and if they do not get what they expect, they are disappointed, and they feel they are owed. That is, they begin to form a great background of internal considering to their lives. This makes them bitter. They feel they have scores to settle. For a person of this kind to externally consider becomes very difficult. But it should not be so difficult for you unless you are crystallized. To realize that you expect the other person to do things you would never think of doing yourself makes a very good starting point from which to begin to externally consider another person. It is a practical starting point and a work starting point. You realize then that you expect the other person not only to do things you would never think of doing, but to be different from you, behave differently, put up with things differently, and so on. Let us suppose you have always compared yourself very favorably with other people, and perhaps even are sure that none of the unpleasant things you notice in others exists in yourself. It will be very surprising then to have the revelation that you are unjust and that you expect others in the work to do what you would not dream of doing yourself. It is always painful to realize that there is really anything wrong with oneself. As was said in an earlier paper, you may often say that you are to blame for something, but if someone agrees with you, it is startling and you feel offended. Yes, we easily pretend we are wrong, but to see it, direct and unmistakable in oneself, is pain. This is real and so useful suffering, for all real suffering purifies the emotions. It only lasts a brief time, as real suffering, and then gets infected by false personality and changes into some complicated negative state, some sort of unpleasant self-pity or endless self-justifying, which is useless suffering. Now, suppose you have to live with a person called yourself. I once read a story of a man who died and went into the next world, where he met numbers of people, some of whom he knew and liked, and some he knew and disliked. But there was one person there whom he did not know, and he could not bear him. Everything he said infuriated and disgusted him, his manner, his habits, his laziness, his insincere way of speaking, his facial expressions, and it seemed to him also that he could see into the man's thoughts and his feelings and all his secrets, and in fact into all his life. He asked the others who this impossible man was. They answered, "Up here we have very special mirrors, which are quite different from those in your world. This man is yourself." Let us suppose, then, that you have to live with a person who is you. Perhaps this is what the other person has to do. Of course, if you have no self-observation, you may actually imagine this would be charming, and that if everyone were just like you, the world would indeed be a happy place. There are no limits to vanity and self-conceit. Now, in putting yourself into another person's position, you are also putting yourself into his point of view, into how he sees you and hears you and experiences you in your daily behavior. You are seeing yourself through his eyes. If you have no self-observation, you cannot do this, because you will simply take yourself for granted as being quite all right in everything. But if you have become sufficiently trained in self-observation to have begun to lose your former ideas of yourself, and if you already have a collection not only of snapshots but of cabinet-sized photographs of yourself in your most typical roles, the case will be quite different. You will be able to see yourself to some extent as the other person sees you, and so you will begin to realize practically what the other person's situation is, and what some of his or her difficulties are, and what it might mean if you had to live with yourself. Of course, the other person must do the same. Some of you may think on hearing this that it is quite right to say that the other person should try to see how difficult he or she is, but notice that we are beginning the other way round. It is you who have to see how difficult you are for the other person. Let me tell you that all this is not at all easy to grasp. You may think you know it already. You may have heard it already, but a lifetime at least is needed to see all that it implies. In the work, relationship is important. Work relationship is impossible without external considering. In general, we must approach one another through the medium of the work. The work and its teachings must lie between you and the other person. You must look at one another through the common window of the work. You must be related through the common valuation of the work, but quite practically, by working. When two people in the work quarrel, they have a great deal of work to do. They may not be ready for it, in which case sore places will be made, just as in life. They may refuse to work on themselves or in connection with one another. They then will both internally consider, both think they are owed, both think that the other should apologize. Of course, if you do not work on yourself and just live and do nothing extra, the work cannot become third force for you. Third force is relating force. In this case, life will be third force, and life divides, whereas the work should unite. Life divides because in life people do not understand one another. They have no common basis, no common language. But in the work, there is a common basis, and people can begin to speak a common language, and so to understand one another. But 10 times more external considering is necessary in the work than in life, and of quite a different quality, because the work is the relating force. If two people in the work quarrel and are ready to work and wish to, then both of them will do so from themselves, not by meeting and talking it over, but simply as part of the work itself. Each will put himself in the other person's position, each see himself from the other person's viewpoint. External considering is very good work. It is not about whether you were right or the other person. It increases consciousness. It includes the first and second lines of work. If you base your existence on internal considering, you will end your lives as most people do. Your lives then are all one-sided, undealt with, undigested. So many unhappy things just left lying about and rotting, so to speak, in the past. So many violent or bitter feelings, so many places to which one has become glued down by past identifying. All this is certainly due to not giving oneself the first conscious shock, to not letting life fall on the work in one. I think one can see so often how internal considering has spoiled life and what a terrible form of identifying it is. It is really like looking at life the wrong way round. And people who can only internally consider and feel that others should be different take hold of one another so wrongly that they accumulate between one another as it were a mass of heavy, dense, negative material to which they get fastened and which they will not give up. But external considering is utterly different. It cleanses you. It frees you. It joins together what is missing by making you see the other side and realize the effect of what you do. It cancels all the feeling of being owed by bringing together the debit and credit sides of the accounts. An hour of external considering will free you from the effects of weeks of internal considering. And the more you can see yourself by observation at the moment, and the more you can see the kind of person you have been all your life, the more you will be able to externally consider rightly. But remember that external considering can only begin in its practical application, with putting yourself in the other person's place and looking out, as it were, of the other person's mind and consciousness at yourself as he sees you. So do not think that external considering is merely doing something for the other person.